The house that winter kept the snow crunched beneath Daniel Morgan's boots as he stood at the edge of what used to be his driveway. 10 years. It had been 10 years since he'd last seen this place. And now, looking at it through the bare winter trees, he could barely recognize it. The house stood like a ghost in the landscape, its wooden walls still golden in the afternoon light, but transformed by a decade of neglect. Snow covered everything, thick, heavy blankets of white that draped over the roof like frosting on a cake someone had forgotten. Icicles hung from every edge, some as thick as his arm, reaching down toward the ground like frozen fingers. The windows, those beautiful windows he'd spent weeks installing, now gaped open like hollow eyes. Daniel pulled his coat tighter and took a slow breath. The cold air burned his lungs, but he welcomed it. It meant he was really here. This was real. He had left in the spring of 2015. Left this house, this land, this dream. His wife Margaret had passed that winter, and everything about this place, the porch where they'd watched sunsets, the kitchen where they'd cooked together, the bedroom where he'd held her hand at the end, had become too painful to bear. So he'd locked the door, climbed into his truck, and driven away. He'd told himself it was temporary, just until the grief wasn't so sharp. But temporary had stretched into years. Now, standing here with snow up to his knees, Daniel wondered what he'd been thinking. How could he have left it all behind? How could he have abandoned something they'd built together? He started walking toward the house, each step an effort through the deep snow. As he got closer, he could see the full extent of what nature had done. The porch sagged under the weight of accumulated ice and snow from countless winters. The railings they'd painted white were now weathered gray, splintered in places. Several of the decorative columns had cracked and tilted at odd angles, but it was the ice that stunned him most. It covered everything like a crystal shell. The entire house had become a sculpture of frozen water, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Long daggers of ice hung from the eaves, and where the roof had leaked, frozen waterfalls cascaded down the walls. It looked like a fairy tale palace, the kind Margaret used to read about in her storybooks when she'd been a librarian. Daniel reached the front steps and paused. A small figure, was that a child, stood in the snow near what used to be the garden, just standing there looking up at the house. He blinked, and when he looked again, they were gone. Probably just a neighbor's kid, curious about the stranger who'd shown up at the abandoned house. He climbed the steps carefully. The wood groaned beneath his weight but held. The front door was still locked, and when he tried his old key, it actually turned. The door, however, wouldn't budge. Ice had sealed it shut. Daniel walked around to the side, finding a window that was already broken. He cleared away some of the ice and pulled himself through, dropping into what had been the living room. The cold inside was different from outside, still and ancient, like entering a tomb. His breath came out in thick clouds. Snow had blown in through broken windows and lay in drifts across the hardwood floors Margaret had loved so much. Furniture stood where they'd left it, now covered in dust and ice crystals that sparkled in the light. The stone fireplace still dominated one wall, though birds had built nests in the chimney. Daniel walked slowly through each room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. In the kitchen, the cabinets hung open, and small animals had clearly made homes here over the years. He found tracks in the dust, raccoons maybe, or possums. In what had been their bedroom, the ceiling had partially collapsed, and snow covered the floor like a white carpet. It should have been devastating. It should have broken his heart all over again. But as Daniel stood there in the ruins of his old life, something unexpected happened. He felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. Nature had reclaimed this place, yes, had swallowed it up and transformed it into something wild and forgotten. But it hadn't destroyed it, not really. The bones of the house still stood. The walls Margaret had helped paint were still there beneath the ice. The floor where they'd danced on their anniversary was still solid under the snow, and more than that, the house had become something new. Something that belonged to the woods and the winter and the passing of time. It had become beautiful in a way he never could have imagined. The ice caught the afternoon light and threw rainbows across the walls. Snowdrifts had softened all the hard edges. Even the decay had a certain grace to it. Daniel walked back to the living room and stood by the fireplace. He pulled off his glove and placed his hand against the cold stone. Margaret had picked out these stones herself from a creek bed 2 miles away. They'd spent an entire summer hauling them back, one wheelbarrow load at a time. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long," he said quietly to the empty room, to Margaret, to the house itself. "I thought leaving would make it easier. But you can't outrun grief, can you? It follows you everywhere." The house creaked in response, settling under its burden of ice and snow. Daniel stood there a long time, just listening to the silence. Outside, the sun was starting to set, painting the snow orange and pink. He thought about his small apartment in the city, about the job he'd taken to keep himself busy, about the hollow years he'd spent trying to forget. He couldn't live here again. That much was clear. The house would take years to restore, if it even could be restored, and maybe that was okay. Maybe some things weren't meant to be preserved exactly as they were, but he could visit. He could come back and tend to the land, clear away the worst of the damage, make sure the property didn't become dangerous. He could be a caretaker instead of an owner, a guardian instead of a resident. As Daniel climbed back through the window into the snow, he took one last look at the ice-covered house. In the fading light, it looked almost magical, a palace made of winter, a monument to time and memory and the unstoppable force of nature. He smiled, really smiled, for the first time in 10 years. "I'll be back," he promised. And this time he meant it.